This next guest is a first-timer here at one of our BamaCarry meetings. She is no stranger to the constitutional debate. She is a retired litigation attorney and well-known writer and speaker on our U.S. Constitution. Before getting a law degree, she got a degree in philosophy, where she specialized in political philosophy and I can't pronounce the other one. Epistemology. Okay, she's a former captain in the Army JAG Corps. Writing under the pen name of Publius Huldah, she uses the Federalist Papers to prove the genuine meaning of our Constitution. And shows how federal judges and politicians have ignored it for over 100 years. She shows how the people can, by learning and enforcing our founding principles and Constitution, restore our constitutional federal republic. As you hear her speak about the Constitution our framers gave us, you will understand why certain factions do all they can to prevent you from hearing her speak. She tells the truth, and she proves it. And just as a point of information here, I would ask those around the edge if they would keep their conversation really, really low as I bring her up so that everyone can hear. And if you have a problem hearing, please raise your hand or wave it and we'll turn her up some. Please welcome Ms. Joanna.
Thank you so much. We are in grave danger of losing our Constitution. Today, I will speak of 4 major changes which are being pushed on us by the globalists and how they're connected. The USMCA trade agreement, the North American Union, and Article 5 Convention, and red flag and other gun control laws. The USMCA trade agreement is about much more than trade. It advances the economic and financial integration of Canada, the United States, and Mexico. It provides for global regulation of a host of issues such as our monetary system, labor, environmental regulation, and immigration policy. The North American Union brings about the political integration of Canada, the United States, and Mexico. But before the globalists can impose the North American Union on us, they need to get a new constitution which transforms the United States from a sovereign nation to a member state in the North American Union. To get that new constitution, they need an Article 5 convention. When Americans finally see how they have been deceived, they will be angry. That's why we must be disarmed now. The success of the globalist plot hinges on their getting a new constitution for the United States. That war is being fought in state legislatures all over the country. And that is something you can help prevent. So today I will focus on the Article 5 Convention. But first, let's look at our federal Constitution. Article 5 provides 2 methods of amending our Constitution. Congress proposes amendments or calls a convention for proposing amendments if 2/3 of the states apply for it. The first method was used for our existing 27 amendments. Congress proposed them and sent them to the states for ratification. Under the second method, Congress calls a convention. We've never had a convention under Article 5. It is dangerous, and James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, 4 U.S. Supreme Court justices, among others, warned against it. They understood that a convention gives the enemies of our Constitution the opportunity to get rid of it. But the globalists have been pushing for a convention for 60 years, ever since the Ford Foundation produced the proposed Constitution for the new states of America. Read this and tremble for your country. In the past, conservatives defeated the periodic pushes for a convention. So the globalists repackaged the push to appeal to conservatives. Their henchmen claim the only way to limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government is to amend our Constitution, and we can only get the amendments to do that at a convention. So let's look at the Constitution they say must be amended to limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government. With this Constitution, we created a federal republic. It is a federation of sovereign states united under a national government only for those limited purposes itemized, enumerated in the Constitution. We listed every power we delegated to the national government. Most of the powers are listed at Article 1, Section 8, Clauses 1 through 16. All our Constitution authorizes the national government to do over the country at large falls into 4 categories: military defense, international commerce and relations. 2, immigration and naturalization. 3, establish a uniform commercial system with uniform weights and measures, patents and copyrights, a money system based on gold and silver, bankruptcy laws, mail delivery and some road building, and 4, with some of the amendments, secure certain civil rights. That's it. All other powers are reserved to the states or the people. So this is a nation only with respect to war and treaties, immigration and naturalization, a uniform commercial system, and a few civil rights. Those are the only purposes for which the states are federated together. For all other purposes, the states are to be independent of the national government. This chart, and I have copies for you, illustrates the federal structure of our government and lists the powers delegated to the national government over the country at large. As you see, it's a very short list. We are a nation only for the purposes listed here. So it's only with respect to the enumerated powers listed in the Constitution that the federal government has lawful authority. If it's on the list, Congress may make laws about it. But if it's not on the list, Congress usurps power and acts unlawfully when it meddles. Tragically, the knowledge of what I just told you has been forgotten. It's our job to restore that lost knowledge. So see me to get copies of this. So why did the federal government turn into Frankenstein? Everybody ignores the Constitution. Ignorance and the collapse of morality brought us to the brink of destruction because we didn't know the enumerated powers. The federal government was able to usurp thousands of powers which aren't on the list. And state and local governments collaborated with the usurpations by taking federal funds to implement unconstitutional federal programs. To claim that these problems can be fixed by amending our Constitution makes as much sense as saying that since people violate the 10 Commandments, God should amend the 10 Commandments. But the Convention of States Project, COS, insists the problem is the Constitution, and we have to amend the Constitution to make the federal government obey it. But the claim that we can control those who ignore the Constitution by amending the Constitution is absurd. Mark Levin and Michael Ferris push for a convention. They say they want amendments to limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government. So let's look at some of the amendments they propose. Michael Ferris's Parental Rights Amendment delegates power over children to the federal government. Section 3 says, "Neither the United States nor any state shall infringe these rights without demonstrating that its governmental interest as applied to the person, your children, your grandchildren, is of the highest order and not otherwise served." Mark Levin's Liberty Amendments also do the opposite of what he claims. His amendment to limit the federal bureaucracy legalizes what are now unconstitutional federal agencies: education, energy, agriculture, environmental protection, etc., etc., etc. Our Constitution doesn't authorize these agencies. They are not on the list. But Levin's amendment legalizes all such agencies for as long as Congress reauthorizes them. Article 1, Section 1 of our Constitution says only Congress may make law. But since Woodrow Wilson, federal agencies have been writing rules, the Code of Federal Regulations. All these rules are unconstitutional as outside the scope of powers delegated and as in violation of Article 1, Section 1. But Levin's amendment to limit the federal bureaucracy legalizes these rules and the rulemaking process for as long as Congress approves them. Levin's amendment to limit federal spending is also phony. Our Constitution limits federal spending to the enumerated powers. If you go through the Constitution and highlight all the powers delegated to Congress and the President, you will have a complete list of the objects on which Congress is authorized to spend money. That's how our Constitution controls spending. But everyone ignores it. Levin's amendment substitutes a budget for the enumerated powers and thus legalizes the current practice where Congress spends money on whatever is put in the budget. His amendment thus changes the constitutional standard for spending from whether the object is an enumerated power and creates a completely new constitutional authority to spend on whatever Congress and the President want to spend on. It thus transforms our Constitution from one of enumerated powers only to one of unlimited powers. And while his amendment pretends to impose a limit on the amount of spending, the limit is fictitious because it can be waived whenever Congress votes to waive it. During September 2016, COS staged a 3-day simulated convention at Williamsburg, Virginia, to prove that at a convention called by Congress under Article 5, the delegates would come up with wise amendments to limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government. And they came up with 6 amendments. 1 for term limits. Here are the others. 1 would make Congress's existing practice of spending on whatever they want constitutional for as long as Congress continues to approve increases in the debt. Another would delegate to the federal government new powers such as I witnessed during the Cold War in communist Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. It delegates to the federal government power over the movement or transportation of persons across state lines. This would provide constitutional authority for the federal government to do such things as require prior approval to cross state lines, require internal passports, as in the Soviet Union, establish checkpoints at state borders with armed guards, and ban the use of privately owned vehicles to cross state lines. Under Article 1, Section 1, only Congress may make law, but one amendment would elevate into law every order or dictate issued by anyone in the executive branch of the federal government. Another would authorize Congress to impose a national sales tax and a national value-added tax. And one would, like Mark Levin, legalize rulemaking by federal executive agencies. The delegates to this simulated convention were primarily Republican state legislators invited by COS, and they showed they are constitutionally illiterate, didn't understand what they were doing, and were steered by persons of insidious views who were present at the simulated convention. The delegates from Alabama were Senators Greg Albritton and Clay Schofield, and a third person who was no longer in office. They voted for all of these amendments except for term limits. Get my flyer on this. So, would Michael Ferris's, Mark Levin's, and COS's proposed amendments limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government? No, they do the opposite. They delegate new powers and legalize powers the feds have already usurped. No amendment can fix violations of our Constitution. When the federal government usurps powers not delegated, they are ignoring the existing limitations on their powers. So the claim that we can get amendments to rein in the power and jurisdiction of the federal government is false. There is another agenda. COS says we must amend the Constitution because people in Washington don't understand it. Rubbish. Our Constitution is so simple, Alexander Hamilton said, the people are the natural guardians of the Constitution. If it's on the list, the feds may do it. But if it's not on the list, they can't lawfully do it. For clauses the Supreme Court perverted, interstate commerce, general welfare, and necessary and proper clauses, we don't need a convention to draft amendments showing what they mean. Just look it up in the Federalist Papers. I've already done it on one page, and you can have a copy. COS's entire case is based on a fabricated George Mason quote. They claim the convention method was added to Article 5 so that when the federal government violates the limits in the Constitution, the states could fix it by amending the Constitution. James Madison kept a journal at the Federal Convention of 1787. I went through it, every page, and pulled out what became Article 5. None of the delegates said that when the federal government violates the Constitution, the solution is to amend the Constitution. They were not silly men. Madison's journal shows that our framers agreed that the purpose of amendments is to remedy defects in the Constitution, and that on June the 11th, 1787, George Mason said, "The Constitution now being formed will certainly be defective, as the Articles of Confederation have been found to be. Amendments, therefore, will be necessary." So they discussed the procedures for making amendments. The Articles of Confederation, our first Constitution, provided for amendments to be approved by the Continental Congress and all of the states. So should the new Constitution also require Congress to approve amendments? Mason said that would be improper because Congress may refuse consent to amendments the people want. So this Constitution doesn't require Congress to approve amendments. So why was the convention method added to Article 5? Madison wanted Congress to propose amendments on their own or at the request of the states. But Mason said the people should be able to propose amendments without asking Congress. He said the convention method should be added. Now listen up. Madison knew that our Declaration of Independence recognizes that a people have the self-evident right to throw off their Constitution, their government, and set up a new one. And thus, they have the right to meet and draft a new Constitution, whether the convention method were in Article 5 or not. So the convention method was added to Article 5, and it provided a way for the people to propose amendments. But it also provided a way to get a new Constitution under the pretext of just getting amendments. The anti-federalists at the convention wanted another convention so they could get rid of the Constitution the delegates had just drafted. On August the 31st, 1787, George Mason said that he would sooner chop off his right hand than put it to the Constitution as it now stands. And if it weren't changed to suit his views, he wanted another convention. So even before the ink was dry on this Constitution, the anti-federalists were agitating for another convention to get rid of it. And that's why, as early as April 1788, John Jay, who became our first Chief Justice, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison began warning against another convention. My rescission and Brilliant Men flyers lay this out. COS claims that Congress has nothing to do with the convention except name the time and place of the initial meeting. They say state legislatures will appoint the delegates and control everything they do. But our Constitution doesn't say that. Our Constitution shows at Article 5 that Congress calls the convention. And at Article 1, Section 8, last clause, that Congress has the power to make the laws necessary and proper to carry out its power to call the convention. And the April 2014 report of the Congressional Research Service shows that Congress recognizes that it has exclusive authority to set up the convention. In Congress's preparations for Article 5 conventions in the past, Congress has shown that it will determine, among other things, the number and selection process for delegates. So Congress can select the delegates. They can select themselves. COS also claims that delegates have no power to do anything except rubber stamp decisions dictated by state legislatures. But that also isn't in Article 5. Article 5 doesn't grant to the states any power to control delegates. Article 5 shows that the only power the states have is to ask Congress to call a convention. Once 2/3 of the states have applied and Congress calls the convention, it's out of the states' hands. COS claims to know exactly how a convention will operate, but page 27 of the CRS report says, in the final analysis, the question, what sort of convention, is not likely to be resolved unless or until the 34-state threshold has been crossed and a convention assembles. So we'll have to get a convention before we know how it is going to operate. COS says a convention is safe because 3/4 of the states have to ratify whatever comes out. That is a lie. Our Declaration of Independence recognizes the right of a people to alter or abolish their form of government and set up a new one. We invoked that right in 1776 to throw off the British monarchy. In 1787, we threw off our first constitution, the Articles of Confederation, and we set up a new constitution which created a new government. How did we get from our first constitution to our second constitution? There was a convention to propose amendments to our first constitution. On February the 21st, 1787, the Continental Congress resolved to call a convention for the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation. But the delegates ignored those instructions, and they ignored the instructions from their states, and they wrote our second constitution. And in Federalist Paper number 40, James Madison, the father of our Constitution, invoked that transcendent and precious right of the people to throw off one government and set up a new one as justification for ignoring their instructions and writing a new Constitution. You can't stop that from happening at another convention. If we have a convention now, George Washington, James Madison, Benjamin Franklin, and Alexander Hamilton won't be there. Who will be there? Constitutionally illiterate people, such as those who attended the simulated convention, and persons of insidious views to steer them to the predetermined outcome, which is almost certainly a new constitution. A third constitution will have its own new mode of ratification. Our first constitution required the Continental Congress and all of the then 13 states to ratify amendments. But our second constitution, drafted at the Amendments Convention of 1787, provided in Article 7 that it would require only 9 states for ratification of the new Constitution. If we have another convention, nothing can stop delegates from proposing a third Constitution with its own new mode of ratification. New constitutions are already prepared. The Constitution for the new states of America is ratified by a national referendum. The states are dissolved and replaced by regional governments answerable to the new Constitution. Under this, to the new national government. Under this Constitution, we are to be disarmed. Here is the Constitution for the new Socialist Republic in North America, 100 pages. The Constitution 2020 movement is backed by George Soros. He wants a progressive constitution in place by the year 2020. He's behind schedule. The North American Union. During 2005, George W. Bush met on his ranch with the Prime Minister of Canada and the President of Mexico, and they sketched it out. This is the task force report on the North American Union, sponsored by the Council on Foreign Relations. It provides for, among other horrors, combining the functions of law enforcement and the military to create a militarized police force consisting of Canadians, Mexicans, and Americans. It also provides for a parliament to be set up over and above the United States. These things are altogether repugnant to our existing Constitution. That's why the globalists want an Article 5 convention to get a new Constitution which transforms the United States from a sovereign nation to a member state in the North American Union. COS says there's no danger because delegates can be controlled by faithful delegate laws. That's absurd. Just as state legislatures and the Continental Congress couldn't control the delegates to the Federal Amendments Convention of 1787, they can't control delegates to an Amendments Convention today. It is the power of a free people to form, modify, or abolish their government. An Article 5 convention is a sovereign assembly with government-making and government-changing authority. The delegates would be the sovereign representatives of the people, but in our venal times, they would be more likely representing the globalists since they have the cash and are financing the push for an Article 5 convention. So the delegates can, like James Madison, exercise that right recognized in our Declaration of Independence to throw off the governments we have and write a new constitution which creates a new system of government. And since it will have its own new mode of ratification, whatever they want, it's certain to be approved. This is why James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, 4 U.S. Supreme Court justices, and others warned against an Article 5 convention. My brilliant men flyer quotes what they said and links to where they said it. I implore everyone who supports a convention to read this short flyer and consider the question at the bottom. Is it possible that James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, Chief Justice John Jay, Justice Arthur Goldberg, Chief Justice Warren Burger, and Justice Antonin Scalia understood something about the plenipotentiary powers of delegates to an Article 5 convention, which you haven't yet grasped? James Madison warned of violent partisans and individuals of insidious views being at a convention. Are there people like that today? Yes, and they want a convention. But COS says only moral and wise people will be delegates. Let's look at that claim. There are 3 ways to select delegates. Would Congress appoint moral and wise delegates? Would state governments appoint moral and wise delegates? Would the people elect moral and wise delegates? Moral and wise people haven't been in charge of anything in this country for over 100 years. And think, how would you prevent the gun-grabbing baby killers such as those who now control Virginia from being delegates to a convention? And now federal spending. The Pew Report says for fiscal year 2017, 36.8% of the revenue the Alabama state government got was from federal funds. And that's a pittance compared with the additional federal money sent into Alabama to local governments, non-governmental organizations, research grants, price supports, subsidies, Medicare, Social Security, etc., etc., etc. Informed, rational people cannot rant and rave about how we need a balanced budget amendment to rein in federal spending when they have their hands out for all that federal money. And all that money and the money sent to the 49 other states year in and year out is added to the national debt. And all that spending is unconstitutional. I say, let's enforce the Constitution we have and downsize the federal government to its enumerated powers. And while we're at it, let's also downsize state governments. I'm old and I remember when state governments were small and didn't meddle in everything. COS trots out celebrities with no expertise on our Constitution to endorse the convention, because they don't know that our Constitution already limits the federal government to the enumerated powers. They can be manipulated to believe that the Constitution is the problem. But amendments don't control governments which ignore the Constitution. The First Amendment didn't stop them from banning Christian speech in the public square. The Second Amendment didn't stop them from restricting and regulating guns and ammo. The Fourth Amendment didn't stop them from spying on us without a warrant. The Fifth Amendment didn't stop them from uncompensated regulatory takings. And the 10th Amendment didn't stop them from usurping thousands of other powers. Alabama has 11 active applications for an Article 5 convention on file with Congress. One of them was sent to Congress during 1833. There is no amendment on the face of this earth which can make those who ignore the Constitution, who ignore the existing limits in the Constitution, obey the Constitution. Our survival depends on stopping an Article 5 convention. The Alabama legislature must rescind all these existing applications for a convention. So what's the solution? 1, James Madison said our Constitution depends on the people having the virtue and intelligence to select men of virtue and wisdom to office. But we lost our virtue and intelligence. We replaced truth, objective truth, with our own opinions. We abandoned personal responsibility. We didn't learn our Constitution and elect people who would enforce them. We cannot restore our constitutional republic unless we face up to our patriotic and moral duties. 2, don't go along with the usurpations. The Declaration of Independence says the colonial legislatures opposed the king's invasions on the rights of the people. Today, state legislatures must oppose violations of our Constitution. Hamilton, Jefferson, and Madison said, since the states created the federal government when they ratified the Constitution, they are the final authority on whether their creature has violated the constitutional compact the states made with each other. And when the federal government usurps powers not delegated, each state has the natural right to nullify of their own authority all such acts of the federal government. Nullification, the refusal to submit to unconstitutional acts, is the remedy our framers advised when the federal government violates the Constitution. The 10th Amendment Center, Michael Bolden's organization, is doing great work on nullification. So, what is the push for a convention really about? We know our Constitution already limits the federal government to the enumerated powers. We know our framers told the states to nullify, refuse to obey unconstitutional acts of the federal government. We know everyone has ignored our Constitution for 100 years. We know that the proposed amendments increase the powers of the government. We know that amendments can't control governments which ignore the Constitution. We know that delegates can't be controlled. We know that a new Constitution can be imposed. We know that new constitutions are already prepared. The Kochs and George Soros are spending millions to get a convention. Why? Because our Constitution is preventing the political integration of Canada, Mexico, and the United States. The globalists need a convention so they can complete their coup against us and get a new constitution which transforms us from a sovereign nation to a member state of the North American Union. If we want to preserve our Constitution and national identity, we must stop an Article 5 convention. Email me to get all my flyers and exhibits, and contact me and I'll give you my email address. Thank you for your attention.